The world, in its vast, indifferent rotation, cares little for the dreams of a young man tilling a small patch of earth. It cares even less when the machinery of war grinds to life, reaching out its ironclad fingers to snatch away innocence, identity, and the very ground beneath one's feet. History, in its grand, sweeping strokes, often forgets the individual, the nameless face caught between empires, forced to wear the uniform of his captors, then his captors' enemies, then his enemies' enemies, until the very concept of home becomes a faded memory, a distant echo swallowed by the roar of cannons and the bitter wind of 1,000 foreign battlefields. Such was the fate that began to unfold for a young man named Yang Kaiwangjang. Yang had known a different life, a life where the world moved at the pace of the seasons, where the greatest struggle was coaxing sustenance from the land, not dodging bullets. He was a Korean, born into a nation under the harsh dominion of the Japanese Empire. His village was small, nestled amongst hills that rolled gently into fertile plains, a landscape that whispered of peace even as the distant rumble of imperial ambition grew louder with each passing year. Yang was in his late teens, perhaps early 20s, strong-limbed from working the rice paddies alongside his father, his hands calloused but capable, his gaze thoughtful. He cherished the quiet rhythms of daily life, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the earthy smell of damp soil, the laughter of children playing by the stream, the hushed conversations with his mother over bowls of steaming broth. He harbored no grand ambitions beyond providing for his family, marrying a good woman and raising children who would know the same simple comforts he'd found in his youth. The world outside his village, with its politics and its wars, felt like a distant, abstract threat, a storm brewing on a horizon he hoped would never reach his tranquil corner of the earth. But the storm was not to be averted. The Japanese Empire, expansive and insatiable, saw not a young man with dreams but a potential resource, another body to feed its insatiable war machine. The notices arrived in the village, stark white papers with unforgiving black Japanese characters, delivered by stern-faced officials. Conscription. For the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, they said, for the emperor, for Japan. But for Yang and for countless other young Korean men, it was for nothing more than forced servitude, a betrayal of their very being. The day he left, the air was thick with unspoken goodbyes and the silent tears of his mother. His father, a man of few words, gripped his shoulder with a strength that spoke volumes of his fear and pride. Yang boarded a train with other conscripts, a sea of bewildered faces, each reflecting his own dread. The train pulled away from his village, from his family, from everything he knew, carrying him eastward deeper into a conflict that was not his own. The landscape blurred, his past fading with it, replaced by the grim reality of his future. The journey was long and arduous, eventually leading him to the vast, windswept plains of Manchuria, a land disputed and fought over by various powers. This was the staging ground for the Kwantung Army, the elite Japanese force tasked with defending their interests in China and confronting the Soviet Union along the vast, contested border. Life as a Japanese soldier was brutal for Koreans. They were treated as inferiors, subjected to harsher discipline, meager rations, and endless drills under the watchful, often cruel eyes of their Japanese superiors. The language barrier was a constant source of frustration and punishment. Yang learned enough Japanese to understand commands, but the words felt alien on his tongue, a constant reminder of his forced identity. He trained with a rifle, learned to march, to dig trenches, to withstand the biting cold of Manchurian winters and the scorching heat of its summers. He was taught to kill, but in his heart he questioned who he was truly meant to fight for. The Japanese were his oppressors, not his liberators. Then came the battle, not against the Chinese, but against the Soviets. It was late summer, but the wind still carried a chill that seemed to bite to the bone. Yang's unit was deployed to a desolate stretch of the Khalkhin-Gal River, a place that would soon become synonymous with slaughter. The Japanese command had launched an offensive, convinced of their superiority, but they had gravely underestimated the might and fury of the Soviet Red Army. The morning broke with a sickly yellow light, illuminating a landscape that would soon be churned into a bloody mire. The air thrummed with an ominous silence that was quickly shattered by the terrifying shriek of Katyusha rockets, the infamous Stalin's organ, followed by a torrent of artillery shells. The earth erupted around Yang and his comrades, sending geysers of mud and shrapnel tearing through the air. The smell of cordite and burning earth filled his nostrils, choking him. Orders were screamed in Japanese, lost in the din. He huddled in a shallow trench, clutching his rifle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Wave after wave of Soviet tanks, T-26s and BT-5s, lumbered across the plains, their tracks churning up the earth, their machine guns spitting fire. Behind them came the infantry, a seemingly endless tide of soldiers, bayonets fixed, roaring battle cries that echoed across the desolate land. Yang fired his rifle, the recoil bruising his shoulder, but his shots felt like drops of water against a raging inferno. Men around him fell, their screams cut short by the overwhelming noise. The Japanese lines, once disciplined and rigid, began to buckle, then shatter under the relentless Soviet assault. Chaos reigned. The battlefield became a maelstrom of explosions, screams, and the metallic clang of tanks. Yang saw comrades disintegrate, torn apart by shells. He saw men panic, abandoning their positions, only to be cut down by pursuing Soviet fire. He fought on instinct, a primal urge to survive overriding all else. He reloaded his rifle mechanically, aiming, firing, reloading again, his mind numb to the carnage around him. But the sheer scale of the Soviet attack was insurmountable. His unit was overwhelmed, outflanked, and decimated. He felt a searing pain in his arm as shrapnel tore through his uniform, but he barely registered it. The world narrowed to the immediate threat, the next bullet, the next charge. And then it was over, or at least that battle was. The Soviet advance swept over his position. He remembered the guttural shouts, the glint of bayonets, the heavy boot that kicked his rifle away. Disoriented, his ears ringing, his arm throbbing, he found himself staring up at the grim, mud-caked faces of Soviet soldiers. They were large, intimidating men, their eyes cold and hard. He was pulled roughly to his feet, his uniform torn and bloody. Hands searched him, stripping him of anything valuable. He was just another captured Japanese soldier, his Korean identity meaningless in the eyes of his new captors. The first chapter of his nightmare had closed, only to immediately open another. The days that followed were a blur of marching, hunger, and chilling cold. He was herded with hundreds of other Japanese and Korean prisoners, marched across vast, desolate stretches of Manchuria, then loaded onto cattle cars. The journey was long, eastward, deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union. The train cars were unheated, packed so tightly that men could barely sit, let alone lie down. Disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, frostbite. Men coughed, shivered, and groaned, their cries echoing in the suffocating darkness. Yang watched as men weakened, succumbed, and were unceremoniously thrown from the train at desolate stops, their bodies left by the tracks forgotten. He clung to life by a thread, his hunger a gnawing beast in his gut, his body aching, but his will to survive, though battered, remained. He thought of his family, of the warm sun on his village fields, and it fueled a desperate spark within him. He would not die here, not like this. They arrived at last at a prisoner of war camp, a collection of bleak wooden barracks surrounded by towering barbed wire fences and guard towers, set against a backdrop of endless, snow-covered taiga. It was a place designed to break spirits, to strip men of their identity and their will. The Soviet camps were notorious for their brutality, and this one was no exception. The guards were harsh, their faces unyielding. The rations were barely enough to sustain life. Watery soup, a small piece of black bread, sometimes a sliver of dried fish. Days were spent in backbreaking labor, felling trees in the unforgiving cold, hauling logs, digging trenches in frozen earth. Yang's hands, once accustomed to the soft soil of his rice paddies, became raw and bleeding, covered in a patchwork of scars. His body thinned to skin and bone, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. The psychological toll was immense. He was a Korean forced into the Japanese army, now a prisoner of the Soviets. His identity felt like a shifting, unreliable thing. Who was he now? A Japanese soldier, a Korean forced laborer, a nameless face in a sea of suffering. He was interrogated, subjected to long, monotonous lectures about the glories of communism and the evils of imperialism. He understood little of the words, only the intent, to break his spirit, to make him forget who he was, and to make him useful to his new masters. He learned to keep his head down, to work until he thought he would collapse, and to survive each brutal day. He learned to hate the cold, the hunger, the constant threat of violence, and the crushing weight of hopelessness. Then, a new grim chapter began. The Soviet Union found itself embroiled in an even greater, more existential war. Hitler's Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front, and the Red Army was desperate for manpower. They began a new policy, conscripting foreign prisoners of war, especially those who were not German or directly allied with them, into their own ranks. For Yang and the other Korean and even some Japanese prisoners, it was a perverse offer. Continue to slowly starve and freeze to death in the camps, or join the Red Army and fight for the Soviets against the Germans. It was not a choice at all. It was merely a different path to likely death, but one that offered a slim chance of survival, of movement, of perhaps, one day, seeing home again. Yang Kaiwangjang, the unwilling soldier, found himself donning another uniform. This time, it was the rough, ill-fitting garb of a Soviet Red Army recruit. He was handed a Soviet rifle, heavier and different from the Japanese one he'd learned to use. He barely understood the Russian shouted at him during the brief, brutal training, but he learned the motions. He learned to march in new formations, to load and fire a different weapon, to obey new commands delivered in a foreign tongue. His fellow soldiers were a motley crew, Russians, Ukrainians, Central Asians, and other reluctant conscripts like himself. They were all united by their fear, their hunger, and their desperate desire to survive. Yang felt like a phantom, a ghost of a man, moving through this new life with a hollow heart. He was a Korean, forced to fight for the Japanese, captured by the Soviets, and now forced to fight for the Soviets against the Germans. The irony, the sheer cosmic cruelty of it all was almost too much to bear. The journey to the Eastern Front was long and grim. Packed into open-top freight cars, they traversed vast, scarred landscapes, witnessing the true devastation of the war. Burned-out villages, shattered towns, endless lines of refugees, and the constant, chilling presence of death. The air grew colder as they pushed westward, the bitter winds carrying the scent of snow and the distant rumble of artillery. When they finally disembarked, the ground was a churned-up expanse of frozen mud and snow, littered with the grim detritus of battle. This was the Eastern Front, the largest, most brutal theater of war in human history, a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Yang found himself thrust into the thick of it. The battles were relentless, horrific. The Germans were a formidable, merciless enemy, their machines efficient, their soldiers disciplined. He fought in skirmishes that felt like hell itself, the noise a constant assault, the cold a penetrating agony, the fear a constant companion. He saw acts of incredible bravery and unspeakable cruelty from both sides. He learned to hate the sound of German Stukas diving, their sirens a prelude to death from above. He learned to distinguish the crack of a German Mauser from the heavier thud of a Soviet Mosin Nagin. He learned to keep moving, to keep low, to keep firing, simply to stay alive. He was no longer fighting for any nation or ideology. He was fighting for the next breath, the next sunrise. One particular engagement etched itself into his memory with terrifying clarity. It was a bleak winter day, the air thick with falling snow and the smoke of battle. His unit was part of a counteroffensive, pushing through a devastated forest against a well-entrenched German position. The trees, stripped bare by artillery, stood like skeletal sentinels, silent witnesses to the slaughter. The ground was treacherous, a mix of frozen mud and deep snow making every step a struggle. German machine guns chattered ceaselessly, raking their lines, cutting down men in swathes. Artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding with deafening force, sending splinters of wood and chunks of frozen earth flying. Yang huddled behind a fallen log, his breath fogging in the frigid air, his fingers numb on the trigger of his rifle. His vision was blurred by fatigue and the stinging snow, his body screaming for rest, for warmth, for an end to the madness. He could hear the screams of the wounded, the guttural shouts of the Germans, the desperate cries of his Soviet comrades. He was just a body, another anonymous face in the Red Army, fighting a war that was not his in a uniform he despised, for a cause he did not believe in. He had survived the Japanese, survived Soviet captivity, and now he was facing the Germans, an enemy whose very name struck fear into the hearts of millions. His unit pressed forward, spurred on by their commissars, their numbers dwindling with every yard gained. Yang fired, reloaded, moved, a machine of survival. But the German defenses were too strong, their fire too heavy. The attack faltered. Men around him began to fall back, overwhelmed. He found himself separated from his squad, disoriented in the snow-choked woods, the sounds of battle closing in around him. He heard German voices, closer now, shouts in a language he only vaguely recognized from his training. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his heart. He tried to hide, to merge with the snow and the shadow of the trees, but the forest offered little cover. Suddenly, a harsh beam of light from a German flare exploded overhead, illuminating the snow-covered clearing with an eerie, blinding glow. In that stark light, he saw them. German soldiers, their helmets distinct, their rifles raised, moving through the trees, sweeping the area. They were close, too close. He pressed himself against a snowdrift, trying to become invisible, but it was futile. A shout, sharp and authoritative, pierced the air. A rifle butt slammed into his side, knocking the wind out of him. Fell tumbling into the snow. Strong hands grabbed him, pulling him roughly to his feet. He looked up into the cold, impassive faces of German soldiers, their eyes hard, their voices barking incomprehensible commands. He was a prisoner again. Another uniform, another enemy, another war he never asked for. He was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of conflict, his spirit broken, his hope extinguished. The world spun, and he knew with a chilling certainty that his nightmare had only deepened. He was now in the hands of the Third Reich, a Korean taken by the Japanese, captured by the Soviets, and now finally seized by the Germans. What further hell awaited him? The world spun, and he knew with a chilling certainty that his nightmare had only deepened. He was now in the hands of the Third Reich, a Korean taken by the Japanese, captured by the Soviets, and now finally seized by the Germans. What further hell awaited him? The cold, hard reality of German captivity was not long in coming. Stripped of his Soviet uniform, clad only in rags, Yang was herded with other prisoners, Soviets, Ukrainians, Poles, men from a dozen nations, into temporary holding pens. The Germans, unlike the Soviets, were systematic in their brutality. Their camps for non-Western European prisoners were places of unimaginable cruelty. Days blurred into a grim cycle of hunger, cold, and dehumanization. He was a nameless face, a number, a piece of meat to be processed. The interrogations were swift and merciless, designed to extract information or break the will. Yang, understanding little German, could only offer confused, silent defiance. He was starved, beaten, and forced into backbreaking labor in the frozen landscape, building fortifications, clearing rubble, digging graves for his fallen comrades. His body, already thin, wasted away further. He watched men die around him, their last breaths a whisper into the icy air. Hope, a fragile flame that had flickered within him through Japanese and Soviet captivity, finally threatened to extinguish itself. But the war raged on, consuming men and resources at an unprecedented rate. Hitler's war machine, once invincible, was beginning to falter on the vast Eastern Front. The Germans, desperate for manpower, began to adopt a grim policy, echoing that of the Soviets before them. They began to conscript their prisoners, especially those deemed expendable or from inferior races, into their own ranks. For the men of the East, the Ostarbeiter or Eastern workers, there was little choice. Die slowly in a prison camp or take up arms for the Third Reich. It was not a path to freedom, but a different road to likely death. Yang Kaiwangjang, the unwilling chameleon of war, found himself facing this twisted proposition. He could barely comprehend the harsh German words that spelled out his new fate, but the intent was clear. He would wear another uniform, carry another weapon, and fight another war that was not his. He was assigned to an Ostbattalion, an Eastern battalion, units largely composed of captured Soviets and other Eastern Europeans. These units were often seen as unreliable, equipped with captured weapons and old uniforms, and relegated to less critical roles, such as garrison duty or coastal defense. This time, the uniform was field gray, bearing the unmistakable eagle and swastika of the Wehrmacht. He was handed a Mauser rifle, heavier and more powerful than the weapons he'd used before. He learned a few more words of a new language, enough to understand basic commands, but he remained an outsider, a ghost in a foreign army, haunted by the faces of his Korean family. The journey westward was another agonizing odyssey, even longer and more grueling than his forced march into the Soviet Union. Packed into overcrowded freight trains, not cattle cars this time, but still barely more humane, Yang and his fellow conscripts rattled across the vast expanse of the collapsing Third Reich. They passed through war-torn Poland, then across the scarred heartland of Germany itself. The landscape changed, subtly at first, then more dramatically. The biting cold of the Eastern Front gave way to the milder, damp air of Western Europe. They saw bombed-out cities, their skeletal remains a testament to the relentless Allied bombing campaign. Lines of refugees, pale and hungry, trudged along roadsides. This was a different war, fought with different strategies, but the smell of fear and desperation was the same. Finally, after weeks of travel, they arrived in France, Normandy. The name meant nothing to Yang then, just another foreign place in a world that had ceased to make sense. He and his unit were deployed to the French coast, tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's formidable chain of fortifications meant to repel any Allied invasion. Life as a German soldier in Normandy was a strange mix of boredom and latent terror. They trained on the beaches, endlessly digging trenches, laying barbed wire, planting mines. The work was exhausting, the food meager, but it was better than the death camps of the East. Yang's days were a monotonous grind. He would stand guard in concrete bunkers, staring out at the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel. He saw the vast, empty expanse, imagining what monstrous fleet might one day emerge from the fog. He ate thin soup and coarse bread, learned a few more guttural German phrases, and watched the faces of his comrades, a mix of older German regulars, young recruits, and other Osttroppen like himself, all bound by the same grim fate. He was perpetually cold, perpetually tired, and perpetually alone. He often thought of home, of his village, of the sun on the rice paddies, a memory so distant now it felt like a dream belonging to someone else. He was a Korean in a Japanese uniform, then a Soviet one, and now a German one, defending French soil from Americans and British, all without ever once understanding why spring turned to early summer. The air grew warmer, the fields greener, but the tension in Normandy grew thick, palpable. Rumors swirled through the barracks and bunkers like a restless tide. The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it. They just didn't know when or where. Allied reconnaissance planes flew overhead almost daily, tiny silver birds that crisscrossed the sky, their buzzing a constant reminder of the storm brewing just across the channel. The nights were filled with the distant hum of unseen aircraft, the occasional thud of an Allied bomb dropped far inland. The wait was agonizing, each day a slow, torturous crawl towards an inevitable reckoning. Then came the night of June 5th, 1944. The air was heavy, humid, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. Yang was on guard duty, peering out into the impenetrable darkness beyond the pillbox embrasure. A low, persistent hum began to fill the night, not the familiar drone of a single plane, but a monstrous chorus growing louder, closer. It was the sound of thousands of aircraft, a vast armada filling the heavens. His German comrades in the bunker stirred, their faces pale in the dim light of a single lantern. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Yang's heart. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading. Suddenly, the sky exploded. Not with bombs yet, but with the silent, terrifying spectacle of thousands of parachutes, blossoming like ghostly white flowers against the ink-black sky. Paratroopers. The invasion had begun. Yang watched, mesmerized and terrified, as specks of men drifted down from the heavens. landing in the fields and forests behind their coastal defenses. Shouts erupted from the bunker, rapid-fire German commands he barely understood. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, tracers arced through the night, desperately trying to pick off the descending figures. Then came the fury from the sea. The first roar was distant, a low growl that vibrated through the earth. Then another, closer, and another. The naval bombardment began, a symphony of thunder and steel unlike anything Yang had ever experienced. Massive shells, launched from battleships miles offshore, screamed overhead with the sound of freight trains, exploding inland with devastating force. The very ground beneath him trembled violently. The concrete bunker, designed to withstand direct hits, vibrated like a drum, dust and flakes of paint raining down from the ceiling. Yang pressed himself against the cold concrete, his hands clamped over his ears, but the sound was too immense, too all-consuming. The air filled with the acrid smell of high explosives and burning wreckage. Shouts turned to screams as shells landed closer, shaking the bunker violently. Orders were yelled, but they were lost in the cataclysm. Yang could feel the immense pressure waves from near misses, could hear the terrifying clang of shrapnel ricocheting off the bunker walls. He peered out through the narrow slit, and the world was a maelstrom of fire and smoke. The beach, once an empty expanse of sand, was now a hellscape of churning water, erupting geysers of sand, and the flashes of explosions. Searchlights from German positions frantically cut through the chaos, only to be extinguished in sudden bursts of flame. His comrades, German and Austrian alike, were screaming, firing their weapons blindly into the night, their faces masks of terror. Yang, a nameless pawn in this colossal game, felt utterly helpless. He gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. Who was he fighting for? Who was he fighting against? He was a Korean caught between empires, and now he was caught between the greatest invasion in history and the immovable object of the German defense. As dawn slowly, hesitantly began to paint the sky with sickly gray light, the full horror of the invasion was revealed. The English Channel was no longer empty. It was choked with ships, thousands of them. Landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, stretching as far as the eye could see, disgorging men and machines onto the beaches. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of engines, gunfire, and explosions. Waves of Allied soldiers, British, American, Canadian, waded ashore through the bloody surf, braving machine gun fire and artillery. Yang watched, paralyzed by fear and awe, as the Allied onslaught crashed against the German defenses. Shells continued to rain down, pulverizing bunkers, tearing apart the sand dunes. His own position became a target. A direct hit on an adjacent bunker sent a shockwave through their position, followed by the sickening smell of burning flesh. Men in his unit were screaming, some wounded, some driven mad by the noise. A machine gun nest just meters away was silenced by a direct hit, its occupants vaporized in a flash of orange light. His bunker was now an island in a sea of fire. He heard the distinct thump-thump-thump of incoming mortar rounds, followed by whistling shrieks that grew louder, more personal. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for impact. The world erupted again, closer this time. The bunker shuddered, cracks appearing in the concrete, dust filling the air. He coughed, choked, his ears ringing from the concussive force. He knew with an instinct born of 3 armies and countless battles that their position was untenable. They were being overrun, bombarded into oblivion. Through the smoke and the din, he saw them. American soldiers. They were moving swiftly, relentlessly up the beach, their faces grim, their rifles spitting fire. They wore unfamiliar helmets, carried different weapons, but their purpose was clear. They were the unstoppable tide. Yang watched as his German comrades, those who were still alive, were either cut down or threw down their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. There was no glory here, only survival or death. He was alone now in his section of the bunker, the others either dead, wounded, or already captured. The noise was still immense, but closer, more personal now. The shouts of the Americans, the distinct crack of their M1 Garand rifles, the rumble of their tanks. He could hear boots crunching on the sand outside, approaching his position. His mind, numb from the endless war, made a decision. He was done fighting, done hiding, done running. He was a Korean, a man who just wanted to go home, caught in a uniform he never asked for, fighting a war he never wanted. A shadow fell across the entrance to his part of the bunker. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the smoky light of the beach. Tall, strong, holding a rifle with a bayonet fixed. An American. His helmet was camouflaged, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, his eyes wide and scanning. Yang slowly, cautiously raised his hands. He held his rifle loosely, not as a threat, but as a symbolic surrender. The American soldier, his M1 pointed directly at Yang, shouted something in English. Words Yang didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Surrender. Yang, in his ill-fitting German uniform, stood there, a strange, exotic anomaly on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. His hands were raised, his face etched with exhaustion and a profound, bone-deep weariness. The American, seeing his compliance, motioned him forward with his rifle. Yang stumbled out of the bunker, blinking in the harsh light of the morning. He looked at the chaos around him, the dead, the dying, the sheer scale of the invasion, and a single, overwhelming thought filled his mind. He was alive. Again. Against all odds, he had survived. The moment of his capture was surreal. He was pulled along with other German prisoners, all disoriented and defeated. But he was different. The American soldiers, their faces etched with the grim reality of battle, exchanged bewildered glances as they saw him. A Korean, in a German uniform, on a beach in France. His features, so distinctly East Asian, stood out starkly among the fair-skinned European prisoners. They shouted questions at him in English, then German, but Yang could only shake his head, offering a few broken Japanese and Russian words, and finally a few phrases in his native Korean, a language none of them understood. The American paratroopers, the vanguard of the liberation, were confused. Who was this man? A Japanese soldier fighting for the Germans. It seemed impossible. They took his identification papers, thin scraps of German-issued documents that offered little clarity. He was eventually interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, a slow, painstaking process involving multiple interpreters. Each time, Yang recounted his unbelievable odyssey. Conscripted by the Japanese, captured by the Soviets, forced to fight for them, captured by the Germans, and again forced to fight now here on the beaches of Normandy. The story was so improbable, so utterly beyond the grasp of ordinary experience, that many struggled to believe it. How could one man endure such a journey, such a series of identity shifts, and still be standing? Yet, the physical evidence was undeniable. His emaciated frame, the scars on his body, the peculiar mix of linguistic fragments he possessed. After initial processing by the American forces, Yang was transferred to a British prisoner of war camp. Here, among a broader mix of nationalities, his story began to find a few understanding ears. He was no ordinary German soldier. He was a survivor, a testament to the brutal, indifferent machinations of war that plucked individuals from their homes and hurled them across continents, forcing them to become instruments of armies they despised. He spent the remainder of the war in Allied POW camps, first British, then later transferred to a camp in the United States. Life in the American POW camps was remarkably different from the hellish conditions he had endured in Soviet and German captivity. There was enough food, clean water, and a general respect for human dignity. The constant threat of violence, of starvation, of death was finally gone. He could sleep without fear, eat without gnawing hunger, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, simply be. He learned more English slowly, haltingly, beginning to integrate into a world that was slowly healing. When the war finally ended in 1945, the vast machinery of repatriation began. Most prisoners were sent back to their home countries. But for Yang Kaiwanjang, where was home? Korea was still a nation divided, scarred by Japanese occupation, and now facing a new geopolitical struggle between East and West. Returning to a devastated, uncertain homeland, after nearly a decade of continuous warfare and forced service, held little appeal. He had witnessed the darkest corners of human conflict, endured unimaginable suffering, and wore the uniforms of 3 warring empires. He wanted peace. He wanted anonymity. He wanted a chance at a normal life. And so, Yang Kaiwangjang made a momentous decision. He chose not to return to Korea. Instead, he sought a new beginning, a quiet life far removed from the echoes of war. He eventually emigrated to the United States, a land he had only ever seen as a prisoner of war. He settled in Illinois, far from any ocean, far from any battlefield. He adopted a new name, James. It was a name that helped him shed the incredible burden of his past, allowing him to melt into the vast tapestry of American society. He lived a quiet life, working, building a family, seeking the simple comforts he had longed for since he was a young man tilling the rice paddies of his homeland. He rarely spoke of his incredible journey, the scars he carried more internal than external. The world, for decades, knew nothing of the Korean who had fought for Japan, then the Soviet Union, then Germany, only to be captured by the Americans on D-Day. It was only many years later, through a quirk of fate and a rediscovered photograph, that Yang Kaiwangjang's unbelievable story began to surface. A blurred black and white image, showing an East Asian man in a German uniform, captured by American paratroopers on the beaches of Normandy. The photograph, once a mere curiosity, became a key to unlocking one of the most astonishing, heartbreaking, and ultimately triumphant personal narratives of the Second World War. Yang Kaiwangjang, the unwilling soldier, the man who wore 3 uniforms, lived out his life in peaceful obscurity in the United States, passing away in 1992 at the age of 72. His story is a powerful, almost unbelievable reminder of the chaotic and indiscriminate nature of war, a force that cares nothing for individual dreams, only for bodies and resources. He was not a hero in the conventional sense, not a general or a decorated ace, but a man caught in the terrifying vortex of history, forced to adapt, to endure, and ultimately to survive. His journey, from the rice paddies of Korea to the frozen Eastern Front, to the beaches of Normandy, is a testament to the human spirit's profound capacity for resilience, even when pushed beyond the breaking point. It's a story that reminds us that behind every grand historical event, there are countless individual lives, irrevocably altered, their personal odysseys often more incredible than any fiction. And for every Yang Kaiwangjang whose story we uncover, there are millions more, lost to the sands of time, their impossible histories waiting to be told. If you were moved by Yang Kaiwangjang's extraordinary tale of survival against impossible odds, be sure to like this video and subscribe to WWII Edit Records for more untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. Every week, we bring you the astonishing true accounts of those who lived through the unfathomable, reminding us that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the incredible resilience of the human spirit.